Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Reese Gerholtz. I'm the Communications Director at World Resources Institute. I'm pleased to host this press call between WRI and E3G on the latest global stocktake text and all that's happening here at COP28. Also, that text was just dropped about an hour and a half ago. And so definitely have some reflections there and have a good lineup to go through that with you. So the speakers today are Alex Scott, Program Lead with E3G, David Waskow, International Climate Director, Jamal Shruji, Associate with the Climate Program at World Resources Institute. I should have said that David Waskow is also with World Resources Institute. And then Gabrielle Swaby, who's the Manager for Diplomacy and Partnerships for Allied for Climate Transformation by 2025, or ACTS 2025, which is in association with their Global Climate Program at World Resources Institute. So I think we'll jump in and give some top-line reflections on both the GST text as well as a quick overview on where things stand on the Global Goal Adaptation text, and then we'll quickly pivot to your questions. So first, I'll hand the floor over to Alex.
Thanks very much, Reese. And I think it's worth noting at the outset that we are waiting for the plenary to start. The purpose of this global stocktake text is really to guide the next phase of climate policy making from countries. And what we can see here is in this latest version is there is a significant majority of countries who've been working really hard overnight to make sure that there's a strong signal coming out of the global stocktake that we need to transition faster out of fossil fuels into the clean economy of the future and adapt at the same time. We can see some strengthening in the text, particularly around the energy package, which Jamal will talk about in more detail. I think what we haven't seen in particular is a lot of strengthening around the finance to enable the next phase of climate policy making and that rapid shift of economies. That's been the crux question that's come up in the debate here in Dubai. There's been a significant group of champion and vanguard countries pushing for a strong switch out of fossil fuels, for a phase out, a very strong phase out. And we've seen questions raised about how you fund that transition and how you fund that rapid acceleration. I think we know that there are strong pathways out of Dubai to answer some of the questions that are still waiting, but we've got time still here between now and the plenary and on the plenary floor for countries to be pushing for the outcomes that we really need to see. I will pause there and make sure that we can have lots of time for questions.
Thank you, Alex. I'll hand the floor over to David Waskow.
Thanks. The energy transition language here signals a significant shift in the terrain on fossil fuels and makes a critically important marker, places a critically important marker in terms of what needs to happen to tackle the climate crisis. We'll go into detail on that language, but I think it's important to note that it presses for change in an accelerated way this decade, and that transitioning away means that we will move over time and before mid-century to an energy system that is predominantly free of fossil fuels. So that's what we see here in the outcome. The menu approach that we saw in the previous text has been removed, and it's clear that every country is part of this effort. Every country contributes. And the last thing I'll note is that we do have to take all of this from here in Dubai forward. And as the text reminds us, the global stocktake is meant to inform the next round of national commitments under the Paris Agreement, the next round of NDCs. And that will be a critical test, as well as the policies of governments. And this also sends important signals to markets, to the private sector, about the direction of travel. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jamal.
Thank you, David. Yes, what we see today is an improvement, in terms of the different elements that are laid out in the text with regards to the energy transition. We see, the text talking not only about how we interact with the fossil fuel part or the renewable energy part, but we also see signals to other sectors that are also an important part of our economies, including on transport, for instance, on nature, on forestry, on sustainable consumption and production. And those are also important signals that this current version of the text, also provides. Perhaps I will go into a bit in detail on what this new text presents us with. First of all, it drops previous wordings of recognizing the need for deep and rapid and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and now calls on parties to contribute to these actions in a nationally determined manner. And so it's a stronger call for action on parties to contribute to these efforts, and then lists down all of the different actions that are prioritized in this paragraph, particularly talking about tripling renewable energy and doubling energy efficiency, things that we have seen in previous texts. It retains the language on phasing down of unabated coal power. This is language that we have seen in Glasgow. It's not a major progression in terms of what is listed there in the text. We also see the phrasing on transitioning away. It does have qualifier language of how this transition would look like. It talks about it being done in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. What is interestingly missing here is the pace as to which this transition would be happening. I think this part can be strengthened in the inclusion of, that we would want this transition to be rapid, as well as, it being just, orderly, and equitable. We also see, retaining of the language around renewables, nuclear, and abatement and removal technologies such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage. It talks about, it introduces a part of the text that wasn't there before on the use of carbon capture and storage, but only in hard to abate sectors, particularly in hard to abate sectors. This language does not limit CCS or carbon capture and storage to the hard to abate sector. It's only, emphasizes that it should be done in these sectors, but this language here can be improved, in order to explicitly say that these technologies should be only, reserved for the hard to abate sector and not delay our transitioning away from all fossil fuels. We see, similar elements that were in previous texts on non-carbon dioxide gases, such as particularly methane. And then, as I mentioned earlier, retaining of the language on transport, which is, the language on transport is also welcome. What, I want to note here in terms of the energy package is the text on recognizing that transitional fuels can play a role. I think this is, a text that does still give, sort of special status to sources of energy like natural gas. I think, this part can be strengthened by, by dropping the transitional fuels altogether, because, if we're talking about transitioning away from all fossil fuels, that means transitioning away from all fossil fuels and not providing special status to any of them. The only additional elements I want to mention is, I think the text can benefit from emphasizing that these actions need to be happening in this critical decade, emphasizing the importance of needing to move fast in the 7 years that are left, to 2030. And then as Alex mentioned, I think it would also benefit from, highlighting or recognizing the cost of this transition, the high cost of the transition, especially on developing countries, and the need for developed countries to take leadership in providing finance and support to help accelerate the transition. So let me Let me perhaps stop there and hand it over to Gabriel.
Thank you very much, Jamal. And yeah, Gabrielle, over to you on the adaptation elements, both in the GST as well as the global goal adaptation text. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Reese. Morning, everyone. With the adaptation section of the global stocktake text, it has been shortened, but I think to the detriment of science as well as local and diverse perspectives. Some key pieces that have been gutted from the text are around findings from the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, really pointing to the fact that climate extremes are happening across the globe, that adaptation challenges exist, and that the risks are increasing with every increment of warning. It has removed references to the intrinsic link between sustainable development and adaptation, and as well the reference to recognizing the importance of meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples, local communities, vulnerable people, persons in vulnerable situations, and so forth. I suppose in effect to clean up the text, but really it does take away from the importance of these elements that are really feeding into the adaptation efforts. What I will say, though, is further down in the means of implementation section, there are references to the fact that the adaptation finance needs to be significantly scaled up, and doing so beyond the current commitment to doubling adaptation finance in support of urgent and evolving needs towards adaptation. So this is very good language that has been added. It does also speak to developed country parties preparing a report on doubling of that adaptation climate finance. This report, though, is not equivalent to a roadmap. So it still begs the question of how developed country parties are going to deliver on that commitment. If I may, before just quickly jumping to the GGA as well, I want to make a couple of points on the loss and damage section, where similarly, we're seeing a few key pieces that are now no longer referenced in the text. There's barely any, it barely touches on the scale of loss and damage that's expected. There has been the drop of pursuing loss and damage as an agenda item. In the process, the UNFCCC process, there are also references that have been removed to approaches that are gender responsive, conflict sensitive, and with respect to human rights. So these are key pieces that have also been missing from loss and damage section. A couple quick points on the global goal and adaptation framework text that has also come out. Essentially, we've moved one step forward, but 2 steps backward. The language surrounding the GGA framework is a bit weaker right now. So instead of committing to close adaptation finance gap, we now only seek to close that gap. It also adds reference to pursuing efforts, trying to reach the goal of reducing temperature rise to 2 degrees in pursuing efforts to 1.5, whereas before the reference not simply, but only referenced 1.5, which made it stronger in the previous version. There's also small tweaks to the language that does reduce the impact and strength of the text, where, for example, now there's a work program to develop as needed indicators for work going further, and as needed is new. Most concerning is that a paragraph that in the previous text has now dropped, where there is now no accountability for developed countries to provide financing to developing countries to support their adaptation efforts. It has this paragraph, while it now reiterates this concept versus request, which was in the previous version. And it now also doesn't mention long-term, scaled-up, predictable, new and additional means of implementation. The one step forward, though, is that there is more references around transformational adaptation, that it recognizes their challenges to implementing transformational adaptation, and that there is now a new request for the Secretariat to undertake some work to examine how transformational adaptation is defined, which has been a key ask in the negotiations. On those points, I'll stop there and hand back over to Reese.
Thank you all to our speakers. Very glad now to turn to questions. Feel free to raise your hand or use the Q&A feature to submit a question. I do want to flag, if you joined a couple minutes late, that we are recording this, and we'll send that recording around shortly after we conclude. But yeah, so please do go ahead and just raise your hands or submit your questions. I will take the first question from CB.
Hi. So the earlier text obviously was many parties were not happy with it. So how do you all feel parties will respond to this new text? And do you think this is the final agreement, or do you think there might be another iteration?
Thanks for the question. I'd like to turn to Alex first, and then others might chime in as well.
I think there's been some really strong lines held by the High Ambition Coalition, for example. And I don't think that this text satisfies a lot of those calls coming from those countries that really want to respond to the climate crisis. So I think this is going to go to a plenary at 10. I think we'll be seeing some strong disappointment from countries who aren't seeing this go far enough. I think we'll have to wait and see how that affects what the next phase of finalizing the Dubai outcome ends up looking like. But I do think there are going to be some calls for this to go further and faster to address impacts, as well as the sources of emissions that are causing those impacts.
Thank you. David, do you want to come in as well?
I think we might also anticipate, as Alex was just alluding to, we might anticipate some interventions on the question of finance, given some of the gaps that we've noted on this call. So there may be some calls for strengthening on that front. I think in some sense, countries may also be looking ahead to the negotiations next year on the new climate finance goal. So I anticipate that there will be some foreshadowing of that set of negotiations and discussions.
Thank you for that. I could go on to the next question from Lisa Friedman.
Hey, thanks guys for doing this. I was just wondering if you could give us, and I know a lot of us packed it in at some point last night, but to the extent you have some color and visibility into into how this final text came about and who was pushing for what when late in the night, that'd be terrific.
I'll open the floor if anyone has any intel or things they want to share in that respect.
Well, I think in basic terms, the presidency conducted a wide range of consultations yesterday throughout the day, and I think up till 3 a.m. And so that laid the ground for how the presidency decided to move forward. We'll see in plenary how parties respond, but those consultations presumably have informed what's in this text. And I don't, we know from the previous evening, some of the views that a number of the parties held, including, as Alex mentioned, the High Ambition Coalition. So the EU, the group of Latin American countries, the island states. So we know that they were certainly protagonists in getting strengthening in this text.
Thanks for that. We'll go to the next question from Kayushi.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, please go ahead.
Oh, yeah, hi. Good morning. Can you tell me the difference of the nuance between phasing out and transitioning away? It's really difficult for us to see the difference, which is stronger and which is more certain and kind of decisive.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll go to David first for this one.
I mean, I think interpretation of COP decisions always evolves over time, but I think transitioning away gives a strong sense of the direction of travel, and away means away. It doesn't mean near or a little bit distant. It really, I think, should be understood to mean truly away. And that's how I would read the text and encourage others to. The other thing, by the way, I would say is the acceleration language in this critical decade is extremely important. And it gives a signal that this is not just a question out to mid-century, but we actually have to really, we have to take rapid action, concerted and rapid action now to shift the trajectory on fossil fuels.
Others want to come in as well. I was just going to mention too, just to draw attention to the paragraph 28, where it does refer to reducing emissions in line with 1.5 pathways. That's kind of bundled with this language around transitioning away from fossil fuels and that happening this decade. So that maybe is notable. I think we'll go on to the next question from Rachel.
Hey guys, thanks again for this. Can you just give a better sense of how much of this is quantifiable? Like, how will this call to action sort of be measured moving forward? Yeah, and just on the adaptation part, the reference on the adaptation gap report, where the cost needs of adaptation are now approximately 10 to 18 times that number. It's been removed in this text. Is that significant at all? Does that change anything? If you could just kind of put that into context, that'd be great.
Yeah, great. Thanks for the question. Maybe we can take the adaptation question first, Gabrielle.
Sure, thanks. Indeed, the reference to the fact that adaptation finance flows are behind the mark 10 to 18 times has been removed. It goes to show that adaptation continues to not necessarily receive the prominence that it needs to in these negotiations. And so I find it is significant. That's a very important piece that gives color to the needs and priorities of developing countries in pursuing their adaptation efforts. That said, the fact that as I mentioned before, there are now references to the fact that the adaptation, the commitment to double adaptation finance is being set as a floor and is in the context of the fact that it pales into comparison of the needs as identified in the adaptation gap report, and that those needs will continue to evolve as time goes by and as the impacts of climate change worsen, is an important complement to that package. So yes, that reference is missing, and it is it takes away sort of that accountability from developed countries in the fact that this is something that they should be taking the lead on. But the fact that we do have that number on identifying what those needs and priorities are for developing countries as the years go by is an important acknowledgement as well.
Thanks, Gabrielle. And just going back to that first question about how quantifiable some of this could be, pass it forward to Jamal.
Thank you, Reese. I think, one way that we can look at this is through how countries, incorporate these actions that they have agreed to here, that they are, potentially agreeing to in Dubai in their next round of NDCs. How does it, translate into their emission reduction targets that are meant to look at 2035 in the next NDCs? How will the next, national climate plans talk about sectoral actions and targets that, and how are they, going to incorporate some of these actions in their climate plans, be informed by what was agreed here in Dubai. So I think that's one indication for how, countries and the potential for these actions, and really the test will, the first big test will be in those next round of NDCs that are meant to come in by COP30. I don't have, in terms of the tripling of renewable energy, that's and doubling of energy efficiency, that's a clear, quantified target. I think, studies can, I think, analyze on how much that would help in terms of emission reductions. But, some of the other elements, it's hard to tell as of now because, they don't have strict benchmarks or, global benchmarks. And finally, the one thing that I would like to say is, it all goes down to implementation and whether countries are putting forward policies and legislation that, and implement those, and investment to implement those actions that would help us, see emissions go down. But, I would still say that, it's really the NDCs that will give us the first, understanding of how countries are dealing with these issues at a national level, and this will come, in COP30.
Thanks, Jamal. I think we'll go to the next question. This one from Megan Rowling.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Just to follow up on adaptation, sorry, I joined a bit late. Apologies if I'm asking something you've already addressed. On the global goal on adaptation, is that pretty much all agreed now? And I noticed that there was in the last text, not this one, a text on quadrupling adaptation finance. But that's gone. And I'm just wondering, I guess it wasn't very likely to stay. But could you just, Gabriel, do you know what happened there? And this mention of a roadmap to come by next year, do we know anything further about that? That's for the doubling. Thanks.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, Gabriel.
Thanks. Maybe on the quadrupling, if that were something that has never been presented in an official text presented by the president or under the authority of the subsidiary bodies chairs. So any sort of text or potential document that was shared that with that particular phrasing has never been an official document under the authority of the presidency. So that's not something that we can compare or look at as a potential basis of comparison. Right now, the only documents that we have ever seen are that from the president acknowledge the commitment to doubling adaptation finance. On the roadmap, there was in the previous iterations an option to potentially see how for developed countries to present a roadmap on how they would achieve the doubling of adaptation finance. That option for a roadmap is not currently in this text. Rather, there is a section of the text that calls for developed countries to produce a report on the doubling of adaptation finance. Now, how developed countries decide to interpret and substantiate that report is then up to them. There is no then obligation for them to delineate exactly the pathway to which they will then pursue to doubling adaptation finance. So it again releases them of that accountability element of showing how they're going to reach that commitment. On your first point of, is this done? I think that's what you were referring to in terms of the GGN sort of, is this done and dusted? And it's still an open question. This is now the latest iteration. We now move towards plenary later this morning, where parties are then going to be sharing their reflections on the text that has been put in front of them. The extent to which parties confirm or even not object to the text is then to be determined. But there are some crucial elements in the GGA text that are missing and that don't speak to what the calls from developing countries have been reflecting over the past couple of days.
Thank you for that. All right, we have a written question from Samini here, asking, what does the draft say about the rich world's willingness to finance the energy transition for everyone else? Alex, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, this has been one of the major questions being asked in the negotiations here. How do you deliver on the scale of economic transformation that we need to see in a way that also helps countries who are still struggling to fund their health systems and education systems, also develop their economies? And I think this text isn't answering that question. It's setting up some scope to keep that conversation going. And there are some parts in the way forward that hint at, having a deeper discussion, a deeper negotiation over what needs to happen to actually help countries implement this transition. I don't think this is the answer that we need on that. There's definitely going to be some strong reactions on finance. As David was saying, there are some major gaps on how we actually finance this transition in the text that's been put on the table here. But I think we'll expect to see that conversation continue for the rest of today. And we'll be looking to particularly, I think, Brazil as the host of COP30, but also the host of the G20 next year, to see what kind of pathway can be set to really properly talk about where we're going to mobilize that finance from and how to support countries to undertake this transition.
Thank you, Alex. All right, we'll go to the next question. Just one from Adam Watt.
Hi guys, with same apology if this was asked at the start. I just wondered if you could give any sense of how this came to be unblocked. What was the sort of quid pro quo or haggling that happened in the early hours? And sorry if this has been addressed, but is your broad sense that the sort of tools on language is strong enough? That's not really, is that an issue or not really? Is that basically fine? I just didn't have a sense of that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Adam. We did cover that a little bit earlier, but maybe David, you want to give a quick reaction to
that? Sure. I think, as I noted before, the presidency consulted a sequence of groups and parties over the course of yesterday, ending around 3 a.m. It's hard to know from the outside exactly what moved what at what point. But clearly there was a strong voice from a number of parties that meant that the text needed to move much more strongly in the direction of a rapid shift away from fossil fuels. So that's what I think we see reflected here. There is language, and I think important language on taking into account different national circumstances and also a just and equitable transition. And we need to really keep all of that in mind as we go about this, that different countries have different capacities, have different ability to undertake this transition. That's one reason the finance issue is so critically important. And we'll have to make sure that everyone can come along on this effort. On the calls on language, I would just say that there's a variety of verb forms that one can use. I think we should consider it in the sense that it is calling on countries to do something. So there are stronger verb forms, but I think it does send a clear signal nonetheless.
Thank you for the question. We'll now turn the floor over to Tim. Tim.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. I think my question has, I think, kind of been answered already, but I just wonder, David, if you could say a little bit more about, what you would want to see in the next round of NDCs, or just kind of in terms of US, thinking kind of about the biggest emitters, US policy or other steps to kind of translate this transition away from fossil fuels this decade into something in the real economy, or where you kind of see companies, oil and gas or energy companies, responding to what is said here, what the effect of this is.
I can comment quickly on that, but I think Alex may want to come in as well, or Jamal. Just to say that I think one of the key tests ahead is whether companies begin to deploy their investments in a different way. We know that by the end of the decade, globally, we need investments in clean energy to be 9 times greater than investments in fossil fuels. And so a key test will be to see oil and gas companies move in that direction. I think it would not be in their own interests to stick with the current roughly equal ratio of fossils to clean energy investments. That's been moving, and I think it'll continue to move. And I think this sends a clear signal to those companies that they're going to need to move even further and even more rapidly in that direction.
Great, thank you. I'm not sure, Alex, you want to come in? I know Jamal had some thoughts as well.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I think it brings me back to what Fatih Birol said, that you can't be on the side of 1.5 degrees and on the side of increasing investment in new fossil fuels. I think the strong signals are there, not just from what comes out in the global stocktake final decisions, but in the politics and the debates around this COP, and in the new countries who have signed up to the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, the Powering Past Coal Alliance. I think the signal of the end of the fossil fuel era is coming through from the debates over this year, since we had 80 parties last year pushing hard for a COP decision on transitioning out of fossil fuels, phasing out of fossil fuels, to a much larger number of countries pushing for the strongest possible signal coming out of the COP decisions this year. This is still not yet gavelled through. There's still, there's still time for parties to react, and for those who are pushing for a really clear, unequivocal signal to keep pushing. But overall, I think that direction of travel has been made very strongly, especially by those champions who are investing in the future. Thanks.
Perhaps I want to come in on the NDC question in particular, because the NDCs do represent an indicator, really, and represent a major part of the success of the global stocktake. How are we seeing, the outcomes coming out of the global stocktake this year are being translated in countries' national climate plans. The text itself, does point, to the global stocktake informing the next round of NDCs, talking about, encouraging countries to come forward with their next NDCs, but it doesn't go as far as, putting language that countries would need to reflect those outcomes in their NDCs. I think, parties usually are hesitant about that because of the nationally determined nature of those climate plans. And then, so I think it will be important to encourage countries to the extent possible to make sure that they are including these outcomes, including, for example, on the sectoral issues and the energy transition part, on how what actions and targets are they planning with regards to transitioning away from fossil fuels, on other issues as well, such as transport and nature. So I think that's something that parties should be encouraged to be doing in their next round of plans.
Great, thank you very much. We have a couple of questions here that are more process oriented. So Bob is asking, what happens the rest of today? Is this it? Will we have a final deal? Is this the final text? And when do you expect the closing plenary to take place? So a lot of, processes sort of questions there. Let's see, I know some of this is reading the tea leaves, but David, do you have initial thoughts?
Plenary, latest we heard is scheduled for 10 a.m. So 45 minutes from now. Plenaries do tend to start a little late, so we'll see. But this text will be brought to plenary, and then we'll see how parties react. I don't want to prejudge what that will look like.
Alex, any reflections from you?
I think unfortunately it's too many tea leaves to read to know exactly how it's going to play out from here. And the number of rumors that have been flying around over what time texts are going to drop over the last couple of days means I don't want to feed any more tea leaf reading. I think there are going to be strong reactions. We'll look at what those end up being and how the presidency responds to them.
Okay, great. And then I have this one last question here. This, I believe, would be for you, Gabrielle. Let me see if I can read this correctly. It says, what are the markets more affected by? Hard time parsing that question. Actually, maybe we'll come back to it. There's a question here on the outcome of Article 6, and I'm not sure. Alex, is your team tracking that closely? Would you be able to comment on where things stand?
I'm afraid we're not tracking Article 6 super closely. There's some language in the global stocktake text as well about carbon markets that I don't know if WRI colleagues have been tracking in a little bit more detail than us, but
yeah. Sorry, neither Article 6.2 nor Article 6.4 negotiations got over the finish line, so those will have to be taken up again next year. There is a text on Article 6.8, which is the non-market cooperation. I haven't taken a look at that yet, but that, as I understand it, is agreed.
And we'll take one last question and then we'll close it out for today. Megan, back to you.
Hiya. Have you been following Just Transition Work Programme negotiations at all? And if so, what's the deal there?
There is a text up. I honestly haven't had a chance to take a look at it, but happy to get back to you with thoughts on that once we do.
Okay, and just finally, sorry, this is a quick one. The new collective quantified goal. What was your take on the text on that?
That's a process text. I don't know if Alex or Gabrielle may want to comment on that, but it's a process text for starting the process next year.
So nothing major.
Yeah, Alex, any reflections?
yeah, it's nothing major in that NCQG text. I think there was some discussion about whether and how you could refer to the NCQG process next year being informed by understandings of adaptation finance needs and transition finance needs. We're not seeing that come through strongly in the texts that have been put on the table this morning, which is basically leaving the question of how you develop the next climate finance goal and how it's informed to those negotiations that will happen over 2024.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right, I think we'll wrap it up there. If you joined late, we will send around a recording, so don't worry about that. And we'll all be tracking this very closely. So please do be in touch with us as we get closer to the end of COP28. All the best.